is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In Washington, D.C., an entire class of second graders fell behind in its reading skills due to the COVID-19 pandemic closing their bricks-and-mortar classroom. Beat reporter Perry Stein took a close look at why this age group of students is particularly vulnerable and how teachers and families are trying to minimize the learning loss. She joins us now. Perry, welcome to EWA Radio.
Thanks so much for having me, Emily.
You focused on students who were second graders when the pandemic hit last March. Why did you want to focus on that age group?
So I've been covering education for a couple of years now, and I do know that, this first, second, third grade year for reading, those are critical. And I was open to writing about, I should say, anyone in that age group. And I happened to stumble along Zalaunshae, a second grader, and I focused on her. But actually, now, if I could choose any grade, I would have chosen second grade because the stakes are really high for them. And, whether you say we should put this much pressure on second graders or we shouldn't, the reality is that, as the American education system, we do expect our kids to know how to read by the end of third grade.
There's the saying that first, second grade, you're learning to read, and third grade, and then once you get to the fourth grade, you're reading to learn, that there's an expectation of some kind of literary fluency, that you're not just thinking about the reading as a process, but taking in content.
Exactly, yes. And, the PARCC exam, which is a big national standardized exam, that actually starts in third grade. So there are some people that consider second grade the end of, early literacy. The NAEP test scores, or the NAEP tests, I should say, start in fourth grade. So third grade, I think it's safe to say that your academics get more rigorous, and fourth grade even more so.
For our audience who are not familiar with DC public schools, give us a sense of the lay of the land. Tell us a little bit about the students. In a normal world, how many of them are learning in traditional public schools? How many are in charter schools like the one you visited?
So DC is a really interesting city. We have about 100,000, a little less, more than 90,000 public school students, although half of them go to the traditional public school system, and half of them go to charter schools, like the school that I focused was a charter school. So just under half of the kids go to a school like Zalaunshae does, which is, a publicly funded, privately operated charter school. The school system itself, or I should say the cities, the public schools, so both the charter and DC public schools, white children are the minority in the school system. It is mostly Black, followed by Hispanic, and then white students. And we have about 47% of our kids, I believe is the latest figure, across both sectors that are considered at risk, which means they're either homeless, they're in foster care, or their families receive public assistance.
And that percentage of those at-risk categories are much higher at Achievement Prep, the charter school you spent time at. Is that right?
Achievement Prep is in Southeast DC. That's in Ward 8, and that's a ward that has the highest concentration of poverty. And while it's not a neighborhood school, meaning it's not a by right or zone school, most of the kids that go to that school live around that neighborhood. And the child that I focused on, she meets these categories. She's at risk, meaning her family receives public assistance. And I think about 70% of the students at Achievement Prep meet that. 13% are homeless. So yes, it is what we would call a high needs, high poverty school.
One thing that I think really comes through in your story is this idea of academic progress and growth, particularly for these younger learners. It's really fragile, isn't it? I mean, they were doing pretty well before the pandemic hit.
The kids in this school, they were struggling before the pandemic hit. According to the school's internal assessments, they were meeting their reading targets. So they were doing really well. This school, they have a curriculum. They expect kind of kids in this school. They use what's called, and I didn't even include this in the story, they use, I believe, the Kip Wheatley curriculum, which is designed by the Kip Charter School Network, but it is designed to how to teach kids who are often, behind what we consider, where kids should be. So they were doing well. They were hitting their internal assessments, but they also, when it came to standardized exams and when they came to kind of the national benchmark that they were still scoring well below city averages for PARCC exams. And we know DC, urban cities tend to score below national trend lines. So they were making progress. They were doing well in the school's internal assessments.
What I also appreciated about your story is I thought you did a really thorough job of giving us a sense of what a reading lesson feels like at both ends of the computer. So you have the teacher's side where she's in this classroom roaming around in an empty room. So the kids sort of see her moving and talking the way they would in a regular room. And then you have the other side, which is what the students are seeing or feeling or experiencing. How did you sort of think about approaching that as a writing challenge? Was it difficult?
It's interesting. I knew I definitely wanted to spend time with Zalaunshae, who's the main kind of character, the kid that I follow around in this story, both in person and virtually, to get that perspective of what she was like virtually. I saw her at her house and I saw her from my house, which was me just logging on to the class. And so, yeah, these classes, I don't know who's sat through these virtual classes, but I am so surprised. I've sat through a few now, both at this school and, a bunch across the city, and they are just fast paced, fast moving. So that to me was the challenge, was just figuring out what was going on. And I'm so impressed that these 6 and 7 year olds are knowing when to break out into certain rooms and know which buttons to click. Really, my goal was to not do this whole story reporting virtually and not to do it all reporting in person, because I wanted both perspectives seem to be what creates the whole of this child's education. So I made it a point to do both, and I did. I actually did not, and this was a decision just because we have to make kind of COVID decisions. I didn't go into the classroom, so I actually wasn't in the classroom. We sent the photographer there, but we wanted to keep it as minimal people as we could.
From a practical standpoint, what's your process for capturing some of these small details? I'm thinking about the students wiggling their fingers to support another classmate who's doing well and what you're observing. Are you jotting it down just as fast as you can in your notes, or are you able to record audio and video?
I'm pretty old school, I think, with that. I tend to do just notes. I mean, I was on my computer when I was watching it virtually, so I was able to, just type out the notes. And a lot of it, was just things that seemed kind of interesting and human to me. But I think all in virtual classes, it's this kind of eeriness, weirdness to it. I knew that Zalaunshae hadn't met any of her classmates before. And so I was pretty struck just seeing them all wiggle out their fingers. And, they were being kids. They were being 6 or 7 year olds, but they were on Zoom calls. And those are the kinds of details that I wanted to capture. But yeah, from a practical standpoint, I just typed it out. Nothing fancy there.
Zalaunshae comes across just as an absolute fireball and a delight. And I'm just wondering, though, what's your approach generally when interviewing young children? It's something that I know some reporters struggle with.
Yeah, it's really hard. And Zalaunshae is awesome. She loved having someone kind of at her house chatting with her. So she made it pretty easy, but still, at 6 or 7, she's not introspective in the way how do you feel your reading is, Zalaunshae? Do you understand what's at stake? I mean, those are not the questions that you really want to ask or you will yield great things to ask a child. So I feel like asking kids specific questions is really good. I mean, this one was readings. Hey, Zalaunshae, what's your favorite book? And she ran in and got that pink Just Grace and the Snack Attack book. And she's like, you want to see me read? And those types of things. I was like, of course I want to see you read. And my intro scene in this story, I describe her kind of snapping her fingers when she sees a complicated word. And that was because she was reading to me a paragraph from Just Grace and the Snack Attack. And I saw her snap her fingers in a very dramatic motion when she got across a very long word. I always ask kids, especially for this, one of the questions I always ask is what do you want to be when you grow up? And I feel like kids really like that question. And if their parents are watching, it actually elicits interesting responses from their parents and a good thing for them to bounce off. So I did ask her that. I found that this interview was a little hard because one, normally during non-COVID times, I would just kind of sit in her house all day and watch her do this, but I couldn't really, the family was strict. I didn't want to overstay. Zalaunshae, I know both her and her mom have some high risk. She has asthma. I went into their house a little bit, but most of our interviews actually took place outdoors. And I found that after 20, 30 minutes, she kind of lost a little bit of interest, which seems normal. So I just came back a few times for 30-minute spurts to kind of catch her in action and talk to her.
I think you just made such an important point, which is this idea of patience being a virtue. And it's something we don't have a lot of, especially when we're writing a story on deadline. So I think like the message here for reporters is you can't expect it to unfold the way it did before. And maybe there is a silver lining here. If you do have to go back a couple of times, you're going to get a kid in a more natural environment and one where they're more relaxed and more willing to talk to you.
Definitely. And, I didn't do a ton of in-person reporting. I mean, I went there a few times. This wasn't like a huge, capture her whole day, huge narrative experience. But by the end of it, she had seen me a bunch of times through her virtual classes. She saw me. I went to her house a few times. And so by the end of it, she was more familiar with me. And, something I always like to do with kids, especially if I'm doing a longer story, is to let them ask you any questions that they have about what you're writing about. Why do you want to write about? I made sure her and her mom knew exactly what I was doing with this story. I didn't tell Zalaunshae beforehand that she was, reading below grade level, but I made sure to tell her mom, just so you know, the teachers have told me what a hard worker Zalaunshae is, but it is going to be in the story that she's about, 6 months behind grade level. So I made sure everyone was comfortable going in. And I think that made all the difference in the interviewing and in-person reporting process.
We're talking with the Washington Post's Perry Stein about the DC Schools Beat and what it's like for young students to learn to read virtually amidst the pandemic. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And many thanks to everyone who has rated us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us grow. This week's episode of EWA Radio is sponsored by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. CZI's education work is focused on ensuring that every student can get an education that's tailored to their individual needs and supports every aspect of their development. Visit chanzuckerberg.com/education for more information. EWA retains all editorial control over programming and content. Perry, I do want to talk about the teachers in this story. I mean, this is a big part of it. We talked about how your job is changing. Tell us a little bit about what you learned about how teaching is changing right now for this age group and for literacy instruction.
I think this story to me was a perfect example of like go into a story with an open mind. You never know where it's going to take you or what it's going to look like. And I didn't even know how much the teacher was going to play a part in this story when I started it out. But, as I mentioned before, these virtual classes, they're so fast paced. So to kind of make sense of it all, I really had to have a very patient teacher, in this case, Miss Jallow, walk me through exactly what she was doing after the class. And I was like, wait, that was weird. Why'd you put them in that room there? And she really explained it to me. She really connected the dots for me. But it was really interesting, the technology that this school had. And I think a lot of schools have this. They have this program, and another reporter or maybe me or someone else can talk about privacy concerns in another story. But they do have this tracker that shows exactly what page a child is currently reading in a book. So if a child's on page 7, because they're reading all these books on PDFs on their computer. If a child's on page 7 and is staying on page 7 for 10 minutes, the teacher, Miss Jallow in this case, can say, hey, why is that kid on that page for so long? Are they struggling with a word, or did they go to a YouTube music video, which I have learned all these kids love to do. So that was something really interesting to me that seemed to be a key thing that this school was using to try to kind of mimic going around to the students' desks to see how they're doing. This particular school had the teachers come to the school and they gave them big TV screens, and this allowed them to see all the kids' faces without scrolling. And the reason why that's important is that it helps kids really participate because the teacher can actually see them. So she can see at any point which kid's drifting off or which kid may have household distractions or whatever it may be. So those were the tools that they were using that I found pretty interesting. They're doing a lot to try to mimic a real classroom. It was very clear that they wanted to be back in a real classroom, and they were just doing everything they could to mimic that experience.
There's some things we don't know yet how this is going to play out in terms of long-term deficits that students could experience because of this pandemic. But you also wrote something that caught my attention on Twitter, and you noted, as you just said, that the students are learning entirely on electronic devices, not paper books. Why does that matter?
I mean, think about when you were even a kid, or even now, look at how many adults love to have bookshelves to show how many books they've read, right? even the teacher, Miss Jallow, told me there's a real sense of accomplishment a kid gets from turning that last page of the book, being able to have a tangible result of what you just finished, not to mention your eyes and computers, but the accomplishment that you feel when you finish a book. I mean, the teacher was aware of it. She wonders if this will dissuade kids from reading because they don't get that sense of accomplishment.
One of my favorite moments in your story is when Zalaunshae's mother describes how she goes around the city doing everything she can to round up books for her daughter, sometimes collecting them from places like little free libraries. I thought that was a beautiful detail.
Yeah, yeah. And that's exactly what I was saying is like, you don't know exactly what you're going to get with the story. For those of you who have read the story, the mom played a big role in this story, even just her pushing this kid when they don't have money, resources. Just everyone's doing the best they can in this story. And unfortunately, it just still isn't enough to keep her on grade level. But I had no idea the mom was going to be part of this. And I asked Zalaunshae when I was at her house, hey, can you bring me your favorite book? I want to see it, and she brought out the book for me. And I was like, where'd you get this book? She was super excited. And her mom told me she got it at the hospital. And I'm like, the hospital, and then that's how I got that detail. And I was like, so you just look around the city for free books for her? And she's like, yeah, that's what I do. I'm just trying to get her some books. So, you never know where that's going to take you. I mean, that's one of my favorite details as well. There's just so much kind of love and dedication in that.
A big challenge for education reporters, even in the best of times, is getting access to classrooms to do the kinds of observations you were able to do. What is that like in DC right now?
I went to a charter school, and right now it's pretty much a one campus school. It's a much smaller school. There's a lot less kind of red tapes I had to go through. And I've been a beat reporter in the city now. I've been covering DC for many, many years. I've been covering education now in the city for 3 years. So I hope it does at this point help a little bit. Oftentimes they know who I am and they know my work, and I hope I've built some trust in that. And so I knew which kind of schools I wanted to go to, and I knew also the people. I reached out to a person who's super plugged in and asked her if she could help me find a school that would be good for this. And she led me to Achievement Prep and to Zalaunshae. And the headline in this story is this entire second grade class fell behind. I didn't know that the whole second grade class fell behind until I had already met Zalaunshae. That's not how I got to this story, because there's this school where the whole class fell behind. That I learned during my reporting. And so I happened to find the school where they were really honest with me with what was going on, and they did give me the access that I needed to do it. So I got lucky. I don't think every charter school would have done it, and I don't think every school system would have done it, but I found one that did.
What's been the response to your story?
First of all, I like to say the Post Local, that's my section that I write for, readers are the best readers because they're so generous. And so far, just a lot of people have reached out and have asked to buy Zalaunshae and her class, the 45 kids in her second grade class, not a single one of whom is reading on grade level, to buy them books. So a lot of people have been mailing books. And I think that like on Twitter and through the emails, there's just kind of, for some people, just surprise at how bad it is. I think people were really moved by Zalaunshae and her mom and the teacher. And I'm really happy about that because I left being like, I just met the two most amazing people after I left their house the first time. But it's bad. I mean, the learning gaps, the learning losses are bad. And I think that some people were shocked. People have been following this stuff a lot. This reaffirmed some of the things that they knew. And obviously there are people that I've come across who think schools should remain closed and don't think focusing on learning loss right now is the right thing to do.
I've long thought that to be a successful beat reporter, you have to bleed a special kind of ink. And I'd love to know what you like about the job.
I love absolute beat reporting. I love community reporting. I mean, I'm in a weird spot because I'm at the Washington Post, which these days is really a national paper, but we do still have local beats, and that is still a big part of our mission. And so I kind of straddle both worlds a little bit. I mean, this story, I did try to write it for a national audience, but I do think that my years of beat reporting allowed me to write it with more nuance, allowed me to find the right family, allowed me to find the right school. Again, I've been doing local reporting now in DC, I think for 6-7 years now. And I feel the urgency of what I write. I feel I understand, I know my audience. I care about my audience a whole lot because this is my community. And that motivates and drives me to do the everyday quote unquote small stories that I think are really important to informing my community that help lead you to those big accountability stories and then help lead you to this story of Zalaunshae. So I cannot emphasize how strongly I think this work is important. And also, I do think local beat reporting is the most fun job you're going to have at a paper. So I feel very lucky for that.
I think you do a really good job, too, of helping people to understand what teachers are going through right now. I mean, we sort of talk about this in this sort of amorphous way while they're teaching remotely. Well, what does that mean? What does it look like? What does it feel like? How are so many of them coming up with creative solutions to these hurdles?
Yeah, take this teacher and this, afterwards I talked to her and I learned that she's an urban fellow. I learned how hard this year's been for her. I learned that she hasn't really met any of her students before because this is her first year at Achievement Prep. So, I think they're just all really, they're working hard. Every teacher that I've talked to says they're putting in more hours than they've ever put in before. This teacher was learning new tricks with the breakout rooms. I've talked to a few other teachers across the city who are just doing truly incredible things. Like we got this PE teacher in DC who's taking his kid on bike rides in the evenings. He was before it got really dark. And that's attracted huge community bike rides here and kind of teaching them about their communities, their cities. I've talked to a teacher who's sent her kids homes with robots that they can program. The creative classes a lot of times are the ones that are giving these kids tangible experiences.
If I'm a local education reporter in another city and I'm going to call you up because I want to follow your lead and write about literacy instruction and reading right now, what kind of questions should I be asking? Who should I be talking with?
What I did learn from this story is that obviously parents talk to them too, talk to what reading looks like in their house and how they're structuring it for their kids or how they're not, or how they, every parent that I've talked to wants to, whether they have the resources or have the time or have the structure, they all want to do what's right for their kids, obviously. And it looks different for every family. So I would definitely see if you can talk to the parent behind the screens. The teachers, that's a totally different ballgame. The interesting thing that I learned that came out of this story, and I'm going to now ask this to all the future teachers that I'm interviewing, how do you effectively teach kids when all of them are at such wildly different levels, even more so than usual? Because you do create these more equitable environments in school. Like every kid has a desk at school, every kid has a lunch at school, every kid has a book next to them. You create these equitable environments in school, but that doesn't happen at home. As I put in the story, Zalaunshae has a mother and is an only child who's able to log her in every day. Some of her classmates, that's not the case. So what's happening is you're seeing these gaps between students widen. And that's much more challenging for the teacher to teach because now even a 6-person reading group, she can't just say one thing or teach one thing that day that is going to be effective for all 6 kids. So that is something I plan to ask more of teachers, and I recommend. I'd be interested to hear what, my colleagues across the country, what they hear from that. How do you give these targeted intervention programs to a kid who's really behind?
Perry Stein joined the Washington Post in 2015 and currently covers D.C. education. She was previously a staff writer for the Washington City paper and wrote for the Miami Herald. Perry, thank you for making time for EWA Radio. I learned a lot.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. Thanks for having me.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there's a story or a reporter you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 70 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.